Hey, Emily.
Hey, Stephanie.
You want to do a podcast?
Absolutely.
Welcome to Cycle Chats, a podcast to destigmatize what it means to be a woman. This is a very special episode with a very special gal. She's on a mission to help you to not be perfect. In fact, she just wants you to be okay-ish. It's therapist and fellow podcaster of Okay-ish podcast, Maryellen Dance. Welcome to Cycle Chats.
Thank you. That was such a nice introduction. I loved it.
I love your opening when I listen to your podcast. It always makes me really excited. Your session is now in progress. I love it. It's like, yes, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you on our podcast and kind of flip the script on you. It's going to be awesome.
I know. It's nerve-wracking now. I'm not used to the script being flipped.
I don't think any of us are. For those of you who don't know, we were actually just on her podcast and we have a bit of a 2-for-1. We were so good. In fact, we were just told prior to this interview that we have 2 parts. So if you want to hear more of us and her podcast, head over to Okay-ish because we love it. Emily and I listen to Emily will like send me links and be like, yo, did you hear this episode? And I'll be like chopping vegetables. And I'm like, yes, waving the knife around in the kitchen.
It's funny because I was just on Apple Podcasts and I was scrolling through your past episodes and there's one on self-sabotage where I literally did like a double take. I was like, wait, how did I miss this? I was like, I missed this one.
That was one of Misha's sync up episodes, but let's get it back on you, Miss Maryellen. I want to know what inspired you to start your podcast.
Well, it was July of 2020. So we were all a little not in our right minds back then. So that's part of it. But really, at the time, the term self-care was really, really popular. And it was really, really pissing me off. At the time that term was really popular, people would come to me and be like, oh, what do you do as a therapist? Just like tell people to have more self-care. And I'm like, or they would be like, I don't need therapy. Like going for runs is my therapy. And I was just getting pissed off by it. And not to mention that I've always had a secret dream of being a talk show host. So like being annoyed with like everyone talking about self-care, plus me always having a dream of being a talk show host, plus it being July of 2020 and all of us were just a little bit nutty from living in a pandemic. I was like, let's start a podcast. It was kind of like the perfect storm.
I mean, yeah, all you had to say was July 2020. I was like, enough said. What I think is nice too, is you mentioned that self-care, right? That buzzword. For a very brief moment of time, I was one of those people that was like, I don't need to go to therapy to have somebody pay to listen to talk about my And then I went and I was like, I'm like a totally different human being now. And I think I've talked about it on every episode. I'm like, therapy, there's something about it. And what's nice is that you are the type of therapist to break down that like self-care doesn't mean like a bubble bath, right? Sometimes it means like cutting very toxic people out of your life. It means setting boundaries and then really diving into what each of those individual things mean. Do you find often the content that you're bringing to the table is really destigmatizing mental health matters from a therapist perspective?
Yes and no. I feel like I like to use the term translating a little bit better than destigmatizing, because obviously we all want to destigmatize. I want to destigmatize. That's a big problem that's bigger than all of us, that hopefully, with your podcast, with my podcast, these conversations, we're all working towards that. I feel like what I'm trying to do is start a little bit smaller, and in the process of destigmatizing, just translating what self-care is, what therapy is. Like, it's not an old man with a big white beard anymore. Like, that's Freud. And, hopefully that will end up destigmatizing. But like you said, like there's so many kind of like popular terms that people get in their heads. And I'm like, wait, I'm over here. Let me tell you what this means.
I went to school for this. Please listen to me. I'm educated in these things. Yeah, I think Emily can agree that there are times where we hear people spewing stuff and I'm like, you didn't go to school for this. Like,
well, and it's hard because like, and I have to keep myself in check because that's sometimes I like lay in bed scrolling through my phone and I'm just like, well, what's going on? But, people mean well. Like, I think people mean well, but at the end of the day, I think sometimes that actually takes away from people who are like suffering from like people who are like severely and persistently mentally ill. And it's, like there's so many like levels and layers and just, there's so much to talk about. That's why I started a podcast.
Well, I just love that you said like like translating, right? It's a great word. And it is like part of the reason that I wanted to kind of bridge over into doing Sync Ups, which is our other smaller podcast under the Cycle Chats umbrella, was because I wanted to give people actionable steps to transform, right? Because it's one thing to be like, oh, bubble bath self-care and like going for a run self-care, like all these things that are lovely and important, but like what steps are you taking to better yourself? That's self-care to me. It's taking the steps to better yourself.
Well, and if I have major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or bipolar 1 disorder, a bubble bath is not going to fix me. Like, it's just not. And I don't know if I remember if I used this example when I had you on my pod. So I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I have a client who I adore her, and she did all the self-care things. She literally read like every self-help book that she could find. She journaled, she drew, she, you know, did the adult coloring books, did the walks, did the yoga, did the bubble baths, everything. And she would come to me and be like, I'm still anxious. What's wrong with me? And I'm like, those things are wonderful, but they don't cure anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, if I had $1 for every time someone told me to think positively, someone has it worse, smile, you have so much to be grateful for. I'm like, or just think yourself out of it. I'm like, do you think I haven't like tried all of these? Like, if that was the case, I wouldn't be dealing with an anxiety disorder. I'm not doing all of these steps because like thinking I myself out of it didn't work. You know,
Think positively. I never thought of that.
Yeah. I'm like, what? My God, you've cured me. You have healed me. Therapy is, in my experience, is so much more than just talking to someone. It's somebody who is trained to like listen to things and call out certain behaviors. I mean, for me, there's been times where I've been in the therapy session and my therapist will say something to me and I'm like, how did you get, like, I didn't even know I was thinking that. And she'll be like, because I can see it in your body language. I can hear it in the way that you're speaking. It's how you're phrasing certain things. I mean, that's the beauty of it, is it's an unbiased eye that is really just looking at you and is not a friend or a family member who has an invested interest in your, like, these people have an interest in your well-being, but they're not so closely connected to you that they can't see those little nuances. So for me, it's been very nice to have that where I can just talk about what I'm dealing with and not have someone go, oh my God, you think those thoughts, like what's wrong? Like you need to go on medicine immediately, you know, and it's that fear mongering, I think, that comes with it, that people don't realize that it's a really healthy place to voice some real wild stuff. And your therapist is like, another day at the office. You think that intrusive thought scares me? Like,
well, and it's funny. We're trained for two things. First of all, we're trained on how to stay unbiased, and all therapists should be doing, you know, continuing like case consultation, meaning working with colleagues, holding each other accountable to make sure we maintain our unbiased stance, you know, make sure none of my own crap is getting in the way. You know, if I'm dealing with something with, you know, whatever, that it's not, I'm not bringing it into the therapy room. So we're trained to do that. And we should also, that's kind of like, we're always keeping that in check, but we're also trained to not react. When I was first a counselor, oh my gosh, I have like a very expressive face. And I was like 21 years old and I was a drug and alcohol counselor. And I didn't know what I was doing, right? And all these people would use these like slang terms that I didn't know what they meant. And they'd be like, oh yeah. And now I'm a 21-year-old, like little white girl from like a nice little 2.5 child family, white picket fence, right? And I'm 21 and they'd be like, oh yeah, well, I couldn't get a ride to rehab today. So I, you know, just gave someone a blowjob to like give me a ride, right? And I would have to be told like, you can't change your facial expression when people say that stuff to you. Because before I would be like, what?
Yeah, I can tell you, I don't think I've ever brought that to my therapist. I mean, listen, like no shade, you know what I mean? I stay home most of the time, so that's not really something I run into often.
So that story, when that person told me that, I said, was that the best decision? And she goes, wouldn't you rather I do that to come to rehab than for some crack? And I'm like, well, I mean, you're right. I would rather you do that to come to rehab than for some crack. But like, let me give you some bus passes.
Yeah. You're like, here, you don't have to do that. So this kind of leads me to our next question. What does being okay-ish mean to you?
Being okay-ish means to me that whatever comes our way, we know we'll be okay. It may suck, but we know we'll be okay. And it's unrealistic that we're going to feel on top of the world every day. And that's also okay. There's so much toxic positivity out there. There's so much unrealistic expectations. And also there's so much extremes these days. And when I started Okay-ish too, like it was like, we're either all the way this way or all the way that way. And it's like, I'm like, let's just be in the middle. That's where Okay-ish came from. I know that's not like a great definition, but that's what it means in my head.
That's what it is, because I mean, there are days where you feel like you're walking in mud, and then there's times where you feel like you're Jesus walking on water.
And both are good. Like both serve a purpose. Both are important for like the human experience. And I think that's the other thing. Like we are almost like taught to shy away from bad feelings or uncomfortable feelings or negative feelings. And I mean, I don't. Like I cry all the time, and I've done that my whole life. Like I'm good at crying. Like I think everyone who's ever met me has seen me cry, which, you know, is sometimes embarrassing.
I think it's beautiful. I cannot wait to get off my antidepressants so that I can cry. Sometimes I'm like, come on, tear. I know you want to come out. The SSRI is holding on to deal life. It's like, don't you, you're going to stay here. And I'm like, no, it's got to come out. It's such like, it's like, they're like thugs in my system, like holding up the tears to gunpoint, and they're too scared to come out. And I'm like, no, it's okay, babies. I need you here. So I miss it. But lately I've been able to choke a few out, and I'm like, yes, this is what I wanted. It's nice. It feels really good.
Well, but that's the thing. Like these quote unquote bad feelings are not bad. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And, you know, I grew up in a kind of, I don't want to say suck it up because that sounds bad. And I grew up in a very like loving household, but like in an era that was like, all right, like too bad. Like, you know, oh, you don't feel good today. You're still going to school. Suck it up, suck it up, suck it up, which I think there's a time and a place for that. But I feel like now we've gone to the opposite direction of, oh, it's okay. You know what I mean? So these just like polarizing things, which is why I think Okay-ish is so important, because it's like, you know what? It's all good. I feel like I sound like a pothead. I don't smoke marijuana, but I feel like I sound like the stereotypical pothead being like, we're all good. We're all okay.
You're high on life.
Yeah.
I mean,
apparently.
So how could we start living a true, authentic, Okay-ish life?
I think by not telling ourselves, not shoulding all over ourselves is huge, right? So I shouldn't feel bad, or I should be happier. I should be thankful. I should be over it by now. All of those things, like, says who?
Yeah. And do you feel like that holds you back a little bit when you're like, I should be over it right now? I think that's a really big one that you hear. Heartbreak. I find that a lot of times, I'll give you an example for myself. I was in a relationship and we broke up, and like, it really wasn't anything serious. And like a year and a half went by and I was still upset about it. And I was like, I should be over this by now. And what I didn't realize is that I wasn't properly grieving it. And I was trying to force myself to not feel bad. And like, instead of just being sad about it, I was like mad, and I was trying to come up with like all these different like excuses and like whatever, like screw that guy and all that, you know. And I just needed to find peace with the situation. And I eventually did find my closure and my peace with it. And then I felt better. But it was like, I just wasn't giving myself that option.
Well, and that's the thing, like our feelings are smarter than us. So we're going to feel our feelings no matter what. We might feel them sideways or backwards or, you know, 2 years delayed or whatever, but like they're gonna come out. So might as well face them head on.
One of my favorite lyrics from a musical called Next to Normal is "Give me pain if that's what's real. It's the price we pay to feel." And like,
yeah,
feelings are a beautiful thing. I love, like, if I'm sad, I'm going to wallow in that sadness, and like, it's okay. I'll put on a sad movie. I'll really give it to myself. If I'm happy, great. I'm going to go out and get myself a little treat, whether that's like a piece of clothing or like an actual sweet treat. I deserve that. My emotions deserve to be treated in whatever way they need to be, because they're valid. They're my truth in whatever I'm going through in that day.
So I want to talk about the valid thing for a second. Okay, now this is me going on a little bit of a tangent. So I agree. All of our feelings are valid. Like, feelings are not right or wrong, good or bad. I always like to say we got to sit in our, we don't want to set up camp there. Like, we don't want to live there in these negative feelings, but we got to sit in it for a little while to get through it. So the valid feelings, oh my gosh, I have been hearing that so much lately and it's driving me crazy. So I need more validation than the average person, I think. Like, I love me some good validation. Like, I just love validation. I mean, we all do, but I soak it up like a sponge. And feelings are not right or wrong, good or bad. But lately I've been hearing a lot of people say, well, my feelings are valid as kind of like an excuse for like negative behavior. And I'm like, wait a second, what is happening? Like, this a wonderful thing called validation that I just want to be showered with all the time is now turning into this, like, I was only a jerk to you that day because I was feeling bad and my feelings are valid. Like, no, wait, okay, there's a few steps in there. Have you guys been hearing this lately?
Actually, I've been doing it. I've been giving people validation in moments where they're being really awful to me. And I'm like, it's all right. Like, your feelings are valid. So thank you. Because now I'm like, I think I'm just doing that to be nice. And sometimes I want to be like, I don't care. You don't see me crapping all over you when I'm having a bad day. Yes. Unfortunately, I have noticed that.
I'm not using it in that way. I will say that.
You weren't at all. I'm sorry. It just like lit a thing in my brain where I was like, oh, I want to talk about this.
You know what that goes to show, though, is that this is why we like talking to experts in the fields that we discuss, because Emily and I we're two enthusiasts. We love learning, and we especially love mental health. We talk about it all the time. We talk about human nature, and you are an expert in the field. And so it's interesting to see the two different perspectives. And it's so nice to learn something from that other side, because what's, I think, unfortunate, and especially in the field we're in, is people can just spout out anything into these microphones. And while it's really great, and I can maybe sympathize with someone and be like, oh my God, yeah, that story mirrors mine. Sometimes you start to veer into the advice column section.
It's hard not to. Yeah, it's hard not to.
But now I challenge people who listen to check themselves, to say, hold on, they're giving advice, but what is this person's credentials? What have they gone through? Who are they learning from? Because I think then that opens the door for you to be able to research and to actually seek out individuals who have dedicated their lives to these things. Like, that's why I'm not my own therapist. And that's why I don't therapy other people, because when they're like, why do I need a therapist when I can just talk to you? You seem like you know all of the therapy stuff. You give great advice. I'm like, because I'm not clinical. I didn't go to school for it. So please go to someone who dedicated their time and money to be able to do this. It's important because we're coming from a different perspective. So I loved that just happened, because that just totally goes to show like what it's all about for Cycle Chats, because this is why we do what we do, is to show two different sides.
I loved it too. Like, I didn't mean it in any way other than my way, but like, it's interesting that we live in this society, right? This algorithm-based society. And we are hearing all of these buzzwords all over the place: boundaries, validation, self-love, self-care, all of these things, right? Which are lovely words. And they all have a very specific meaning. But now I'm going to go off on a little tangent. But when I was in high school, because, right, we're all around the same age. So I'm sure the people listening also went through this in high school. In high school is when the word gay started to get used as a derogatory word.
Yeah.
Oh, that book is so gay. Like, a book can't be gay. Is it a happy book? Like, I don't know. Did it like another man book? Like, the books don't have gender. I don't know what you're talking about. And I got very upset by this because my brother had come out when I was a freshman in high school. And I started hearing it around the hallways. Oh, that's so gay. All of this totally unnecessary wordage around the word gay. So I remember in English class, we were given a project. I don't remember the exact parameters, but I ended up taking the project that I was given, and I went up in front of the class and I wrote the word gay on the board, and I put it in the thought bubble. And then I did like all these different segments coming out from it. And I was like, what do you think of when you hear this word? And my classmates responded. I wrote on the wall. I was like, okay, let's look at the dictionary to see what the word gay is. And I wrote it on the wall. Right. And I was like, so how can these things be that? I was like, we need to stop using that word in a derogatory way, because it's not. So if you're saying, oh, that book is so gay, or those shoes, no, it just wasn't the right way to use that term. So I think that's like,
really is a homoerotic book, then it is gay, but the good kind.
Yeah. but the good kind, or if it's just a happy book, like it's just so, it's crazy to me. Right. But so that kind of goes into what we were talking about, right? These like buzzwords that we hear, and then people kind of change the meaning or the intention of the word. And then it starts becoming even hotter. And then it's like everybody's saying these things and they're spewing these like words that they're hearing through other people, but they're not doing the research themselves to see what is that word? What does that mean? What does that mean at the core? And how can I step forward and use that word correctly so I'm not spewing nonsense, so that I can say these things with knowledge behind it?
Such a great example. Like that is such a great analogy, what you just shared. Well, and it's hard because a lot of the terms have different meanings, right? So anxious is a feeling like sad or happy or angry or whatever. And generalized anxiety disorder is a mental health disorder. And people are using those two terms interchangeably, and they're different, you know?
OCD, that's another one. I have OCD. Like I actually have OCD. So when someone's like, my OCD just doesn't let me not keep my house clean, I'm like, no, I have a pile of laundry, and sometimes it's hard to even try to clean because I'm so riddled with rumination of having to clean the thing. I'm like, that's not even close to what OCD is, but continue.
But thanks. Tell me more about how clean your house is. Yeah, it's hard. And I think that people are, and not you, like Emily, you use the term that your feelings are valid. Your feelings are valid. Everyone's feelings are valid. Our behaviors are not necessarily always valid. Sometimes we as humans have poor behaviors. Sometimes our feelings come from irrational or invalid thoughts. And so maybe we can like correct those irrational or invalid thoughts. But like what I see is people using it as like an excuse. Oh, it's my OCD. Oh, it's my anxiety. Oh, it's this. And sometimes that can be an explanation. Like sometimes it can explain or like paint another picture. It can be kind of like another chapter in the story, but it's not the whole chapter. And it's almost like it's not fun to have a mental health disorder, you know, like we don't want to like glamorize it. It's okay, but it's not fun.
I think people do. And I think that's another social media thing. It's like trendy to be, I don't know, depressed and anxious. And I'm like, no. And again, it's funny because I look back at when I wasn't disordered and I was like, and I wouldn't say that I'm like disordered, but like it's still a work in progress. Some days are better than others. I've been having a rough week and I have a lot of symptom flare-ups, and I'm like, it's all right. Hey, listen, we're gonna float through this like we have before.
You're okay.
I'm okay-ish right now. I'm not phenomenal, but it's funny looking back and seeing how I used to almost glamorize it. And I do feel that because I used to make it such a joke that it was inevitable. And I think that it led me down the path to finally like, oh, you want to know what I can really do? And now I'm going through this. So when people are like, my anxiety, I'm like, dude, you don't even know the half of it. I wish I was a little bit nervous about the weather.
And here's the thing. It doesn't mean that those person's feelings are invalid, but we need to label these differently. We need to make sure that we're not trying to compare apples and oranges. And I feel like another thing to mention is like we as human beings, this is just like a human thing. We are all very susceptible to the power of suggestion. So in my abnormal psych class in college, which I actually teach abnormal psych now. So like, that's really fun. Like, it feels like it's like come full circle. But in my abnormal psych class in college, I remember she gave us a letter, and now I do it for my classes. I copied her. She gave us a letter at the beginning of the course that was like, you can diagnose yourself with any of these things I'm going to talk about. So, for listeners, abnormal psych class is basically, it teaches you all the mental health disorders. So this teacher was like, you can look at this list of symptoms and be like, oh, well, I've had that. Oh, well, I'm like, is that me? Is that me? But like, don't diagnose yourself. Like, you can't diagnose yourself. You don't have these disorders, like unless a medical professional has told you that you do. But like the reason she did that, and the reason I now do that for my classes, is because without a doubt, we'll be talking about something and someone will raise their hand and be like, but I think that's me. And I'm like, it's not.
This is why Google is not an anxious person's friend. And someone's like, I just have to know. And I'm like, you don't have to know though. Your anxiety does. You don't have to.
Even non-anxious people, like we are just prone to the power of suggestion. It's not a bad thing, but it's something we have to recognize when we're like scrolling through TikTok and it's like, do you have ADHD? To be like, no, you don't. I mean, You might, if you've been diagnosed by a mental health professional, but
I had a friend recently go like, she was like, yeah, I'm just, trying to keep my mind off the fact that I've convinced myself this stomach pain is stomach cancer. I'm like, I don't think it's stomach cancer. She goes, no, I know it's not, but for some reason I've gone down the rabbit hole. And I'm like, well, you did that to yourself. I can't, and then I ended up doing it the following like day after. I just was looking up this one thing and I was like, I wonder if I have that, and that led me down the spiral. And I'm like, well, I did this to myself.
Yeah. I mean, we all do it. But I think right now, in the past, we could filter it because we were in more control of it than we are now. Like we're not in control of all the suggestibility messages we're getting. Yeah. Maybe those are appropriate for some people and they work for some people, and some people can relate to them, but that's just an important piece of this, to recognize that like it's not a bad thing that we're all prone to suggestibility, but that's what it is suggestibility, not necessarily like fact or diagnosis.
I think that's why education is like so important, and just like going out there and like what Steph was saying earlier, finding people that have actually gone to school for these things and like have the criteria that they need, instead of just like watching somebody on TikTok, like you were saying, who's nobody who's gone to school for this and is giving advice, like a little scary. Make sure to proceed with caution.
And it's just not good for our own like self-esteem and self-worth.
That kind of, I think, ties in perfectly to what is your favorite piece of advice you've ever learned from a guest?
I'm like, what do I say first? One guest once told me, and so the things I've learned from guests, some of the things I've learned from guests, I don't think was originally from those guests, but it was where I heard it first. Someone told me once about how learning when setting boundaries that other people's problems are not their emergencies. And I love that. Because I love boundaries, talk about boundaries all the time, and I had never heard that, and I was like, oh my gosh, like that's amazing. So I loved that. I think from guests, I really like to hear how other people, because I always ask other people like, how are you, like tell me a story when you were just okay-ish. And I love to hear that because I have so many of those stories. I feel like it's good for listeners to know that other people are a disaster too. I feel like it's validating for me to know like, okay, I'm not the only disaster around here, and being able to laugh about it and being able to like be with each other in talking about those like truly okay-ish, like less than okay-ish moments. Like I don't know if that's something I've learned, but that's something that like I've really valued, and it's just like I said, like validated what I'm doing and like the message I'm trying to share.
I love that you said the emergency doesn't constitute an emergency. Yeah. I used to say a lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. And that was one that I used to use when I was trying to be tough with my bosses at work, because we had one that Emily and I both had one that just awful with time management. And then all of a sudden her lack of planning turned into our emergency. And I was like, no. And no, I'd still do it anyway, because I didn't know what boundaries were at the time. Emily did. Emily was like, no.
I came in and then I left that place, that horrible place.
I am very good at saying no.
I'm better now. My God. Now I'm like, I'm going for a walk. No, that doesn't work for me. People are like, oh, okay. It's right. Okay. Now I'm going to go live with this guilt of saying no to you for 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, you should talk to your therapist about that.
I did. Trust me. It's on the list for tomorrow. I'm very excited.
One of the things I was going to say this earlier, but I got sidetracked at it. So I'm going to say it now. One of the things I cannot stand as a therapist is when I have something going on in my life and someone says to me, if I'm like talking to a friend or an acquaintance or someone about it, and they say to me, well, what would you tell a client to do? That makes me irate. Let me tell you why it makes me irate. First of all, I'm biased when it comes to myself, obviously. Like I can't think of myself in an unbiased way because I am me, that's why I have my own therapist. But the other reason it makes me irate is because what I would say completely depends on the client and completely depends on the situation. And I like to share that because, it just annoys me. So if you know me, don't ever ask me, what would you tell a client?
I hope people stand outside your house with signs now. What would you tell a client? Just random people in the grocery store. If you see Maryellen, just hold up a sign.
I'm going to ignore you because it shows that it's not a one size fits all. It's not, person A is having this problem, so therapist says this. Like it's not like that at all. And I feel like we have, in some ways, not always, but in some ways we've like oversimplified things. So I like to share that because I'm like, it depends. What I would say to a client depends. And I'm not going to say that to myself because I'm biased.
So because I know in this journey of Steph and I almost having the podcast for 18 months in June, it's significantly changed who we are, our communication style. I say this like every episode, so I apologize, listeners, but it really has. I'm so thankful for this aspect of my life. So I want to know how your podcast has changed your life.
Oh gosh. In a lot of ways, both good and bad, I'll be honest. So some of the ways it's changed my life that aren't so great are I'm really busy. Which can be good and bad. I feel like I'm a way better version of myself because I am constantly learning. And before the podcast, I was constantly learning, but now like I do a podcast every week. I'm learning faster or more or whatever.
Expedited learning, if you will.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So I feel like that's made me a better person, which then makes me a better therapist. So it's definitely changed my life in that way. It's connected me to so many people, which I think is probably my favorite part. Like so many people who I wouldn't normally meet or talk to, you know, now I'm having like deep, vulnerable conversations with, and like deep, vulnerable conversations are kind of, you know, my thing. So I really like that has also been awesome. But man, it's tiring because here's the tiring part. Actually, talking isn't tiring. Sometimes if I'm like, I don't know what to talk about, that is the part that's hard for me because I know what I want to hear, but I also know that I'm biased because I'm a therapist, you know, and sometimes I'm like, okay, what do people who aren't therapists and who don't talk about feelings all day want to hear? So I feel like that's the hardest part for me.
I get that because you're coming from a different perspective. I know, like for me as a makeup artist, when I do makeup, some of the things I want to talk about for makeup, some people are like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. No. And I'm like, oh, okay. Sorry. Because
you probably want to talk about fancy things. If I were asking you about makeup, I'd be like, okay, so how do you actually put on mascara without poking yourself in the eye?
To me is like not even something that like I would think to, you know what I mean? So I think I completely understand where you're coming from because you're like, oh, this is super intriguing and people want to hear about this.
On the other end, there are certain things where I'm like, oh, I'm kind of bored. Like, I don't want to talk about boundaries again. I talk about boundaries all the time. But like, yes, I talk about boundaries all the time. Other people don't talk about boundaries all the time.
And if they are, sometimes it's incorrect information and it's very extremist type of information. So
I cannot tell you how many people in my personal life, like my close friends who know me well, you know, are used to me, but other people, if I'm like just meeting people or in like a social situation where like friends of friends are there, I'll like start talking about something and they'll be like, oh my gosh, like I haven't had a conversation like this ever. And I'm like, what? Like I forget that people don't talk about feelings all the time.
Dude, you're telling me, man, side note, but like there are times I start talking and I'm like, I forget that like this isn't common knowledge to people. And I feel like through anxiety recovery for me, I've actually been educating my family because they didn't know and I didn't know, but I had to go through it in order to be able to tell them what I needed. I had to communicate it and they're like, I never thought of it that way. And I'm like, you know, I forget that I'm the one that's been more involved in it. So it's also a little bit sad sometimes too. People don't tell you that therapy can be a little bit sad because you're like,
therapy's uncomfortable. And
you're
it's
like,
hard.
wow, you're like these people that I like put on pedestals are just like completely unaware of their, like sometimes I see people in my life that I love so much and I just see them struggling and they don't want to deal with their emotions and it absolutely breaks my heart. And that's something I had brought up to one of my first therapists I ever had who I absolutely adored. And I told her, you know, I didn't realize that I would be learning how to be a better version of me, but then also watching the people I love cope in such a like sad way. Like I almost could see how I used to cope and how lost I really was through that. And I was like, I don't know if any of that makes sense to you. And she's like, no, it totally makes sense. She goes, it's hard because you're working on yourself and you're trying to be better. And you're seeing some of maybe the unhealthy coping mechanisms that you used to do. And you're seeing where some people could use help because you were in that position before. And she goes, and that's hard because you can't fix them. And I'm like, oh, but I want to. And she goes, you made the decision decision to come to therapy, they have to do the same thing. I'm very grateful for Emily because she is somebody that completely gets it. And when we talk about therapy, she's like always down to learn something new and celebrate that and watch her grow as she watches me grow. And that's a very comforting feeling because it is a bit hard to watch people you love still struggle, but you have to step back, love them for who they are, and create boundaries so that you don't get hurt in trying to lose yourself in helping them.
So, what does women empowerment mean to you?
You warned me, like you told me what questions you were going to ask me, and I thought about it, but I'm still like, oh, because that's such a big one.
It's a big one. It's a biggie.
So women empowerment means to me that women everywhere feel secure in being themselves. Like that's all it means to me. And we won't always feel comfortable in being ourselves or confident in being ourselves, but we know that we can be ourselves.
It's an acceptable answer. And then my last question for you is, what advice would you give your 15-year-old self?
Okay, that's cool. And will you tell me some other people's answers?
Oh yeah. It's usually let go of the boy.
So first of all, I would say that I don't want to go back. So I think part of what I would tell my 15-year-old self is that it'll get better. But the other thing I think I would tell my 15-year-old self is I have always, and I still do to this day. So can my 42-year-old self come tell my 32-year-old self this? I vacillate between being like, yeah, I'm confident, I'm secure in myself, I like who I am, into like, oh, it's okay if you treat me like crap. And so I would tell my 15-year-old self, like those moments and those times and those things and those people that make you feel the good way, just like dive right into those, just like bathe in those and, kind of let the rest of it wash away.
Yeah. I mean, ditto.
I was there. I needed to hear that.
Yeah. Well, there were times when I was 15 or in high school or in college where I was like, yeah, I'm a badass and I would do badass things. And then I would forget.
But that's all part of being okay-ish. I think the journey to be okay-ish, right, is like, you're going to have ups, you're going to have downs, you're going to have sideways. I never thought of that. I'm like, I am going to sometimes have a sideways. And that's okay.
Sideways,
upside down
are okay.
Yeah.
And
it's all good.
Oh, I have another thing I would tell my 15-year-old
Give
self.
it to us.
Stop being jealous.
It's not worth it. Same girl.
It's not worth it. Like I would tell my 15-year-old self, I mean, I don't have the answer of how to not be jealous, but like, if you can give less attention to jealousy of the cooler girl or the girl that the guy likes, or, that's so much wasted time.
I think a way to not be jealous is to be inspired. I think that the opposite of jealousy is inspiration. So instead of being jealous of someone, now I'll go, I want to be inspired by them.
Well, I think like some of the things, hopefully you guys can I'm sure you guys can relate to this, but some of the things that make me the most insecure are also things that make me the most secure, just in different lights or different situations or whatever mood I'm in. And so like, telling myself now, actually, let's be real, like those insecurities like are also like your strengths that, it just,
I agree. Because there are times where I will feel really cool and then I'll get around someone who just isn't on the same wavelength. And I have to remind myself, it's not that I'm uncool. It's that this person isn't my cup of tea and I'm probably not theirs. And that's fine. We do what we got to do. And then I don't have to like go out of my way. I used to be a big like, I got to get like the people that don't like me to like me. And now I'm like, dude, if you don't like me, that's totally chill.
That's the biggest thing that I learned during the pandemic. I just don't, I don't care. I can count my friends, like my close friends on my hand, my friends that are within a 10-mile radius on one finger. It's Stephanie. And there it is. That's it. And that's okay. Like, I don't need any more than that. I have my husband. I have myself. I have Steph. I have good family. Like, I'm self-sufficient enough where I don't need to be a people pleaser anymore. I don't need to like hang out with the cool drama kids that actually make me feel really crappy about myself because they're mean. I don't need that anymore. I'm good. I got my book. You can leave me alone. Like Steph said, I may not be your cup of tea, but you're certainly not mine.
That's all it has to be. Not, I don't know, this weird, like, let's hang out with each other. Let's exchange numbers. And I've had that with a few acquaintances where I'm like, no, I think like we're really going to hang out with each other. And if I'm not texting, I'm certainly not getting any messages in reply. So I think it's important to realize that reason, season, or lifetime. I have friends that work friends where if I'm doing a show and I see you, I'll hang out with you. But once the contract ends, I'm not going to reach out to you if I'm in jail to come bail me out.
That's my job.
Not that I'm saying I'm going to like go in jail, but you know what I mean? It's Emily.
It's my job. I've already bailed friends. I've already bailed friends out of jail. That was a college story. True. I'll save that for another day.
Well, this was so much fun. I love speaking with mental health professionals, and I just especially loved speaking with you because you are so like clinical, but not. And like, you just make it so comfortable, right? I don't want to be like, you make it easily digestible. You make it comfortable. You make the space comfortable to talk about disorders and mental health. And like, you add humor to it and you're just so real. Quite frankly, I think everyone needs to be able to get to know you more like we have. So where can people find you? And do you have any fun projects coming up? Yeah, it's a twofer question.
So people can find me. It's the Okay-ish podcast, OKAYISH podcast. On Instagram, my name is Maryellen Dance. According to Google, I'm the only Maryellen Dance in the world.
Now, when you're like at weddings, does someone be like, Maryellen, dance? And like, you got to go out onto the floor and like shake a leg?
Yeah. So people do that to me all the time. And the annoying thing about it is that every single time someone does it, they think they're the first person who's come up with that. And they're like, oh my gosh, isn't it so funny? See, like it's a verb. And I'm like, well, no, you didn't think that because you asked if other people do it.
But I looked at it and I was like, someone else has said this. I called myself
Thank you
on
for
it.
recognizing
I was like, I said it and I was like, it's pretty obvious. I think, I mean, people would have to be real stupid not to think of it.
It's so funny though. People think that they're like the most clever person in the world. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I'm not going to dance right now, but like, I get it. So my mom's name is Candy Dance. True story.
She an exotic dancer? That's amazing.
And the best part about it is people think they're going to offend me by being like, what's her job?
No way. She sounds like a burlesque dancer. Candy Dance.
I'm like, you're not going to offend me. Like I tell people this to make friends. Like it's a very good conversation starter to be like, hey, my mom's name is Candy Dance.
That's her real
She's so
honest to God government name.
It is her real honest to God government name. She did marry Mr. Dance, my dad. So she was not born with that name, but she has had that name since 1979.
God, wow. Some people get all the luck with their names.
Right. And I tell my parents all the time, like, I like my name, but I'm like, so why didn't you name me like Swing? Like, why,
Swing dance.
Like,
That's so funny.
They're like, we didn't want to be cruel. And I'm like, but I would have loved it.
Oh my God. That's amazing. Or break dance.
Oh my God. I mean, it's limitless opportunities.
The list goes on.
Well, that's going to be your nickname from now on for us. Either break dance or swing dance. So when we DM you and we use that name.
Hey, Swing, how's it going?
Perfect.
Well, like Steph was saying before, this episode was amazing. The conversation was exactly how I thought it would go, and that makes me so happy. I advise you to now go back with the idea of Maryellen as Cher from Clueless, because Maryellen is Cher from Clueless. Her voice is Alicia Silverstone. If Alicia Silverstone is listening right now and you ever need a voice double, I mean, call Maryellen. She's here.
And Paul Rudd, if you ever want to date too.
Yeah, we could share him.
Oh, I have another thing to tell my 15-year-old self before we sign off. Cycle Chats reminded me of it. 2 things to tell my 15-year-old self. 1, you're going to get great boobs. So like, stop worrying. 2, stop worrying that you haven't gotten your period yet, because when you do, it's going to suck.
I'm still waiting for the boobs to come in, but
Same.
it's going to happen one day. It's all good. They're still tiny.
I got
and
the
mighty.
butt though.
I got the boobs. Yeah. My butt's fine, but I like my boobs.
Yeah, I got the eyes. Those are big. But anyway, thank you for listening. This is awesome. This was a train off the track kind of conversation, but with passengers along the way. We saw the best scenic route. I loved it. If you are listening, you can find us at Cycle Chats, all lowercase, on Instagram. Visit our website, www.cyclechats.com. This is dropping in June. So if you're listening, that means that we are starting some really fun projects coming soon. So that means that we are starting our YouTube channel, and we will be dropping a new episode of our podcast every day for the first month, and then dropping our new show, which I will announce through our lovely reel. So you should go and check that out, because that's going to be there. And that reel is amazing. Stephanie and I worked very hard on that, and it's hysterical. So make sure to look out, go and subscribe to our newsletter so that you do not miss a thing, because these new projects is very exciting and we've worked very hard. So come and join us on our journey. Join Maryellen on her journey. And as always, we hope you'll sync up with us next time.